You're listening to a tuned in, dropped out production. Thanks, y'all. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Yes We Cannabis, a journey into medical marijuana. I'm Callie, your friendly, outdoor grown, probably high, neighborhood medical cannabis consultant, and we are back, finally, to talk about one of my favorite things, nature's medicine, aka cannabis. Thank you so much for being here. I know I took a bit of a break there for a moment. Sometimes life throws you into the roughest of storms, and taking a step back to hermit is the only way to get to calmer waters. I am finally at a point of finding my footing after a lot of big change. I started my apprenticeship with the local union UFCW 3000 at the end of September, which was always going to be its own sort of challenge due to some past experiences, which I'll get into later. And at the same time, the plumbing in my old house decided it had had enough, and my room flooded for the third time living in that house for me, which caused an unexpected move, which is always going to wreak havoc on the nervous system. And to top it all off, the little shit cherry on top of the shit Sunday, I've also had to deal with 2 really rough staph infections the last month. I seem to be prone to them these days. And if you have ever experienced a gnarly staph infection, you know it is something that you wouldn't wish on your worst of foes. Really, let's be real. But I am now finally settling into a routine with my job. I am feeling nested in a really wonderful new space, and I'm finding my way back to a sense of ease, something I think cannabis has had a nice hand in. I'm very grateful to be where I am now. But the physical, emotional, and mental ride the month took on me was somehow more chaotic than anything else that has happened in the last year, which is really saying something. And no matter what, change, even when it's good change, can be a lot on the nervous system. Something that my other neurodivergent buds out there will know very, very well. I also want to just throw a big thanks out there to my community for the support and the understanding, to my partner, Zach, for literally being the best cheerleader I could ever ask for, and for Cannabis for helping me get through some of the toughest moments. I love you. I love all of you. So I have really been wanting to get back to Yes We Cannabis, or as my friend Tiffany says, my weed podcast, for weeks now, but the timing was never quite right. But I will say, inspiration did hit a couple days ago, and once the wheels get turning, there is truly no stopping the creative train, baby. I just gotta go chugga. What can we say? Which does lead me to the topic of this episode. I think that it is time to talk about medicinal cannabis and mental health. Okay, so to start, I do need to throw a disclaimer out there immediately. Both of these topics are not heavily researched at the moment. Cannabis, because of the systematic socio-political issues that it faces, and mental health, because of very similar problems paired with the fact that we are only recently starting to really understand the functionality of our brain on a biological level, and this includes our mental health. Historically, people have just been thrown into asylums, lunatic, mental, the like, and for a really long time, people who suffered and continue to suffer from mental health issues have not had the resources they have needed to face their realities. I do think it's also safe to say that our current understanding of mental health and mental illness has only recently really come to fruition. I can even say within my lifetime, I have seen really big steps and bounds being made, something I'm personally and forever will be very grateful for. And something that is definitely late to the party is research on how cannabis affects our mental health. Because of the lack of, quote, credible research, hello. Because of the lack of, quote, credible research out there, I do want to state that this episode is informed by my personal experience and understandings of this medicine that has led me to truly feel that the medicinal effects of cannabis help my depression and ADHD, but we still are fighting stigmas that even keep it from being a viable reason to get a medical cannabis card, which creates barriers in its own way. But nonetheless, most of my community that uses cannabis medically does so in the ways I do, to find sustainability in the day-to-day while having to regulate our nervous systems. And as a deeply neurospicy person, I can actively say that the last month would have felt perhaps perhaps impossible, if not just a lot harder if it weren't for that sweet, sweet, sweet herbal medicine. So, all that being said, I do want to make sure that it is known that I'm going to be talking about my personal experience with cannabis and my knowledge as a medical consultant, which has influenced my understandings of the plant. All right, nice disclaimer out there. There'll be more, I'm sure. So I want to start by bringing some cold, hard facts y'all's way. I think it's really important to lay the foundation for my personal understandings and my experiences on a scientific level. This episode is going to be ultimately more of like an op-ed piece, which is kind of new to this project, and it's going to probably jump about a bit, so stick with me. But I just really want to make sure that I stay rooted in as much research and facts and like true experiences as I can. So let's go. All right, if you've been on this journey with me from episode 1, you will probably remember some bits and bobs about the endocannabinoid system, or the EDS, which is a system that runs all through our body almost in tandem with our nervous system. And to freshen our memory, the EDS is a system of endocannabinoid neurotransmitters that bind to cannabinoid receptors that exist on almost every part of our internal systems. For example, organs, bones, immune system, all that jazz. This system helps our natural cannabinoids, anandamide, AEA, and 2-AG, which are some of the more widely researched, travel through our body and latch on to cannabinoid receptors found all over our internal system to help us maintain our stress levels. I do think it is important to note that our natural cannabinoids help us maintain our stress levels. Cool. So, there are 2 kinds of cannabinoid receptors in our body. We have CB1 and CB2. Both of which are found throughout the entire EDS system. CB1 receptors are primarily found in our brain and central nervous system, and CB2 in our peripheral organs, which are the organs not like directly related to our nervous system. So these receptors allow cannabinoids in our body to bind to them, which allows the nervous system to distribute them accordingly to all the different parts of our body. Now, like our body, the cannabis plant also produces natural cannabinoids, THC, CBD, CBC. You might have heard of them. If you'd like a little more of a deep dive into those, please feel free to go back and listen to episode 2 of this show. It's all about cannabinoids, and I talk about the most popular cannabinoids in cannabis, and you get to know a little bit more about them. So have fun if you want. But getting back to it, when we ingest cannabis, smoke it, eat it, use it topically, the cannabinoids present in the plant find these receptors in our brain, our organs, bones, etc., and they slot themselves into our EDS, our endocannabinoid system. So these cannabinoids then act together with our EDS to help provide therapeutic relief for the parts of our body that need it. So along with cannabinoids, you will also find a blend of different terpenes in cannabis, which are going to be naturally occurring compounds that are found in so many parts of our natural world, definitely a lot of plants, and they help provide therapeutic effects when they interact with our body. Some great examples would be pinene, which is also found in, maybe you guessed it, pine trees. It's really great for mental focus, as well as our bronchial system. If you ever go to the woods and you take a big, deep breath of that fresh air and you feel refreshed, that is pinene hitting your system. Linalool is another that you might hear me talk about often. It's found in abundance in lavender, which is a very sedative and anxiety-reducing terpene. And if you want a deep dive into terpenes, you can head back and listen to episode 3 of our show. I get into where terpenes are found and which ones are popular in cannabis and how they help us. All right, so I do know this is a lot of information to dump quickly, but I do want to just make sure that we all have a good foundational understanding of how cannabis interacts with our body before we dive into the topic of mental health. And for the sake of everyone, I'm going to pare it down even more just so we're all on the same page. So, when we ingest cannabis, the natural cannabinoids and terpenes found in the plant travel through our body along the endocannabinoid system and find the right receptors to slot into so the perfect therapeutic effect can settle in and provide relief where it is needed. So there are so many different cannabis strains with different combinations of both cannabinoids and terpenes that help provide very specific therapeutic effects. And you can really kind of figure out what your perfect cocktail is. For example, if you really want to wind down at the end of a long day and get that good kind of rest in, a really heavy indica strain with high levels of myrcene and carotene and linalool would be really ideal. For instance, if you want a wakey strain, Keep your eye out for perhaps a sativa dominant strain with high levels of limonene, because that's going to be nice and wakey and just like really uplift you. The choices, honestly, they probably are endless at the end of the day. Okay, cool. So I'm feeling pretty steady on this foundation that we have laid, and I'm ready to start moving into the topic of this episode, which is mental health and cannabis. So to begin, I do want to mention a context warning and perhaps like a little bit of a trigger warning for those who need it. I am going to be talking about my depression and my ADHD in this episode, and I'm not going to go into too much like very specific detail in regards to the extremes, but I do know that it can be a really hard topic to sit in sometimes, and if you need to skip this episode because of it, please do. Take care of yourself first, right? It's the most important. Put your mask on first. Right. So as I mentioned before, a lot of what I'm going to talk about in regards to how cannabis, I do need to say potentially, ultimately, affects mental health comes from a blend of scientific research and then my personal experience and understanding of the plant, which I do note is entirely my own. We'll call it an intuition, if you will, an informed intuition. But for the sake of credibility and legalities, I do have to throw a stamp of acknowledgement in that I do need to throw a stamp of acknowledgement in there that I am not a doctor. I am only a licensed medical cannabis consultant, so take that as you will. All right, let's get into it, shall we? So my personal cannabis journey is deeply, deeply related to my mental health journey. And in order for me to really do the herb justice, I do think that we're going to have to get into some of my backstory. So buckle up, Buttercup. Let's go. So I have major depression disorder and ADHD. Major depression disorder, also known as clinical depression, is a disorder that makes it difficult for my body to make enough serotonin and dopamine for my brain. That's going to be needed to keep day-to-day functions really sustainable and my mood uplifted and elevated. Ultimately, I tend to feel a sense of heaviness and sadness pretty often. That just makes it hard to muster the energy and capacity to show up consistently as what some would call a normal functioning human. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD, on the other hand, is a developmental disorder that makes it difficult for my brain on like a chemical level to focus ultimately. This can include focusing on tasks that are in front of me or that really need to get done. It's really difficult sometimes for me to follow conversations, especially if my mind is occupied by something that my brain truly just does not want to ignore. And it also definitely makes it very difficult for me to stick to a set schedule. And if you know me at all, this probably makes a lot of sense. So ADHD is more of a recent discovery on my end, but I have always known that I do have some sort of depression because one, it does run in my family, and two, when I was younger, I used to feel a lot of shame for feeling so sad when I had so many privileges others didn't, and when I felt I didn't have a reason to. And sometimes even the little devil in me would secretly wish something horrible would happen in my life, so I had a reason to feel that way. Looking back now, I can firmly recognize that younger me was just trying to make sense of a chemical imbalance that happens in my brain. I was living what I thought was a normal experience for a long time, and I didn't realize that the routines and patterns I'd created to help me sustain having to even like simply exist were all heavily influenced by my very real mental illness or neurodivergency. So I really could also get into the weeds when it comes to the Pandora box that is mental health, because really when you open that lid, you ain't closing it again. But again, another time. But I do think it's important to have an understanding of how these disorders can affect a person's life, at least how they affect my life. So cannabis and me. So cannabis, on the other hand, was something I started exploring about 3 years ago. So I always knew I would find my way to cannabis when the time was right. I knew it in my gut somehow, and the time indeed was right in 2021. We were all deep in the first year of a pandemic, and I was starting to embrace new wants and desires, which included trying cannabis. And once I tried it, the rest was history. There are truly so many reasons that I love cannabis. And one of the biggest contributing factors to that love is how it has helped me deconstruct my mental health, which has had to be one of my main focuses this past year due to the mental health crisis that I experienced last October. And I do feel that it is time now to talk about it. So that's what we're doing. So as I've said in the past, I do not believe it's possible to talk about cannabis without also acknowledging its history, which is inherently political and rooted in systematic issues. I feel the same way about mental health. Unfortunately, mental health issues have been stigmatized in their own ways and face an uphill battle as well, one that is inherently embedded in our culture's sociological structure that affects our everyday lives, even if we aren't fully aware of it. And with that, I also think that it is really important to recognize and validate that the last 4 years have not been kind to us as a collective. We have not been able to collectively grieve and recognize the trauma that we all endured as a humanity when we were thrown into a quarantine while we watched unprecedented events occur over and over again from our little phones. We haven't been given the opportunity to really trauma bond as a society in a way that's actually cathartic. It has only really felt and led to what feels like more isolation. And when you are forced to continue life as normal, even though normal doesn't exist anymore, the road to burnout is indeed a very slippery slope. Another huge contributing factor, in my opinion, which I truly do believe is important to put on the table, is how complacent late-stage capitalism has become. So despite the fact of and threat of a global pandemic ever looming, many companies, big corporations, they were still making record-breaking profits. And if there's one thing that capitalism breeds, it is the insatiable hunger for more money. And the easiest way to make more money, and if you are a business, a big company, a big corporation, is to cut costs, which often intend to fall on the necks of their employees. And this is where my story is going to slot in. So in 2022, I returned to a serving job that I had been working prior to April of 2020, which was a job where I was a server in a 3-course fine dining lunch restaurant located in the corporate cafe on the Microsoft campus in Redmond, Washington. So ultimately, I was serving fancy food to all the bigwigs of Microsoft where they would come and have meetings about business. Very interesting job. Rubbed elbows with some very, very important people. Sometimes I look back and I'm like, how did I find myself in these situations, Chance. Anyway. So this job, I got it pre-pandemic, and it was exactly what I needed while I had been pursuing my performance career. But things really, really started feeling different when I returned after a couple years away for the pandemic. The people, everybody, people in general were more stressed than ever. The greed that Microsoft breeds was at a new level of extreme. And the company I worked for, Compass Group, which is the food vendor for Microsoft, was following suit. So over the course of the year, I watched both companies lay off hundreds and thousands of workers while at the same time publicly claiming that they were doing better than ever economically. For example, Microsoft pushed to purchase Activision Blizzard in 2023 for $75.4 billion. That is billion with a B. While at the same time, laying off over 10,000 of their own employees during those negotiations, claiming that they were needing to cut costs. And once the purchase was solidified, they also proceeded to lay off over 1,900 Activision Blizzard employees. And that same year, they also closed 4 Bethesda studios, which is another video game company they had overtaken, costing hundreds and hundreds of more workers their jobs. I also do want to note that the EU tried to block this purchase because they knew that it was going to create a monopoly in the video game industry, which in turn, Microsoft had to go to Congress to get approval to go through with the deal because it indeed created a monopoly in the video game world, which is the most profitable of the tech industries. So this is just one instance of fiscal priorities being skewed. In my opinion, Microsoft is one of the largest companies in the world, and they're not hurting for profit. They don't need to be cutting costs, right? My employer, Compass Group, was also doing the same, claiming record-breaking profits, but they would always forget to disclose the number of workers that they had laid off in order to keep funneling all that money to the top. People were fearing for their jobs and in turn their livelihoods. Every conversation that I was having at work with employees, both Microsoft and Compass, they seemed rooted in deep, deep worry. And despite all the cries for help and all of the outrage, the workers were really just not being listened to. And people were being pushed to new limits. And I was watching my coworkers burn out before they even began their days. So this is just like the tip of the iceberg when it comes to reasons both Compass Group and Microsoft are big bads in my book, which is a topic for another day. Lots of topics for another day in this episode. But I can say, now that I have seen the underbelly of the beast of what corporate America looks like, there's just truly no going back for me. And then when an opportunity to help my coworkers came literally knocking on my door in June of 2023 in the form of a union or in form of union organizers, I immediately knew that I had to jump into the fire. All right, so at the beginning of October last year, I fell into the worst mental health crisis I have experienced. I had been pushed to my limits in so many parts of my life. I was in the midst of unionizing my job while also having to continue working at that job, which was traumatic on its own. And when you throw the pressure of unionizing on top of it, it is truly a shit show. I was working what felt like a job on top of my job for months, which also came with an emotional and mental stress like I had not quite known. And once management and corporate got wind that I was involved, the micromanaging and the turncoat energy when I was at work was just almost unbearable. And if you have ever had experience unionizing a workplace, you will be familiar with the lengths that those in charge will go to in order to stop their workers from practicing the legal right of unionizing. And most of these lengths are illegal to do, I do want to point out. We can get into the inner workings of that another time as well. We're pinning so many other conversations. So while this was happening at work and after work, work on top of work, I was also having to navigate and deal with removing a very emotionally abusive narcissist out of our communal home, which was inherently a very dysregulating experience, especially when I had considered this person a friend and suddenly the safe space I called home was steeped in an almost volatile energy. And if you've ever had to remove a narcissist from your life, you will know how emotionally taxing and damaging the experience can be, especially when that person is using the known nervous system triggers you have when trying to get a rise out of you, which is an empathetic neurodivergent person's nightmare, one that is not uncommon, unfortunately. It's easy for not nice people like narcissists to take deep advantage of very empathetic people. This chaos cocktail that was my life, paired with my own personal neurodivergency, pushed me to the edge, and I completely burnt out. Mentally, physically, emotionally. I was pushed to leave my job on the Microsoft campus in the midst of unionizing. I did make it to ratification, which is always a win, but by a combo of both lack of boundaries set on my end, but also by the ones that I had communicated not being respected in like every avenue, which is also like a recovering people pleasers like nightmare, setting boundaries and not having them respected. It was too much. The emotional stress was taking a toll on my mental health and in turn my physical health. And it eventually led me to a place where I truly didn't know how I was going to be able to live another 30 plus years feeling that the way I did, physically, emotionally, mentally. Which is something that I had never said out loud to another person until then. Even if I had brief moments of thoughts through the years, I had never vocalized it. But I will also recognize that despite the hardship, it was also one of the best years of my life. I was finding my footing in the first year of my current relationship, which has changed my life in the most incredible ways. My best friend of 15 years moved to Seattle, and better yet, into my house. Summer was fucking gorgeous. And even if it was challenging beyond words, I found my place in fighting for worker and human rights. And it's a place that I can channel my energy and my passion into, where I can truly make a difference, which is a new kind of calling, I think I can say. So the first half of the year, great, fab, wonderful. The second half, chaos, painful, murky. A perfect example of how two truths can be held at once. So I found myself in a situation where my mental, physical, and emotional well-being was pushed to an unhealthy place. And it has been a year of regular therapy, internal family systems, to be specific, finding the perfect cocktail of pharmaceuticals, Wellbutrin twice a day, gabapentin for emergencies, a lot of exhausting and painful nights of tears that eventually started to become more cathartic and relieving than terrifying, journaling until my hands hurt and cramped, paring my life down to simplicity and predictability, something that my nervous system really needs right now, and deep, deep communal healing. And weed. lots of weed, a year of weed. I also do want to acknowledge that I am incredibly fortunate to have a really wonderful support system. And I was also able to take a couple months off to recover, which is a deep privilege. And I see it and I acknowledge it. And I was very fortunate enough to recover to the point of being able to get back to work, because we always have to get back to work. It eventually led to me exploring the cannabis industry, which is how I ended up here. So I am and will and do show a lot of gratitude ultimately, even though it was very intense and it's been a lot. I'm very happy to be where I am right now. So it has been a really difficult year in all avenues of my world. The road to healing from a mental health crisis is long, it's unrelenting and uncharted, but it's doable, even when it feels the opposite. There have been moments when I have been in the deep spirals, sitting in those neural pathways of shame that have been so deeply embedded into my brain, those pathways that are easiest for my mind to take in the stressful moments. And those hard moments, they have felt hard. And it's a different kind of hard than I've experienced before. It's the kind where existential dread is always just on the other side of that pathway, behind a door that is far too easy to open, and you have to do everything in your power to not answer when the dread comes knocking. And speaking of existentialism, let's get back to cannabis, shall we? So when I first explored cannabis in 2021, I was pretty quick to discover why it's considered medicinal in the community. So on the surface, it makes you feel great. And that's just it. It makes you feel great. It helps relax your muscles. It eases your mind. Helps you let go of stressors from the day. It provides relief for the pain that won't always go away. It also helps you find your belly laughs again, and it helps highlight the joys, the little joys and the little moments in life where, the ones that actually matter. And those are the places where you can find the most sustainable kind of joy. But it's also something that my depression makes very hard to do. It helps me rest, which I have not been accustomed to, for sure. And trust me, you might think you know rest, but if you are a high-functioning and performing neurodivergent depressed girly, and you finally experience what it is actually like to rest, you might realize that we have been damn bamboozled, y'all, when it comes to understanding what is important in life. And I'll tell you what, it is rest and community and giggling. And I can say that for me, the process of identifying wounds, ripping them open, and facing the feelings that have been buried for years is a lot easier when I have a tool to help calm my nervous system down on a physical level, allowing me to consciously focus on healing my mental wound. Healing mental health is a different kind of tiring. It requires the willingness to sit into what might sometimes feel like mental anguish in order to start healing the neural pathways that are so deeply embedded that it stings like wrestling with the thorniest blackberry bush. But let's not forget, our brain is responsible for our entire nervous system, that system that literally keeps us alive. And when your brain is exhausted from having to face that pain in order to heal itself, the rest of your body is going to feel it too. But you still have to go to work. You still have to make money. You still have to pay bills. You still have to make rent, because if you don't make rent, you can lose your home. And if you lose your home and you're unhoused, you can be arrested for it. And in some states, and for real, that's happening in our country. And those stakes are really high. They feel like life or death stakes, and they can be. And when you have to live in those kind of stakes day in and day out, your nervous system is pretty easy to trick into fight or flight, which is a really hard place to be when you have a mental illness. Because fight or flight can trigger one of the biggest episodes of depression and anxiety or mania that you might be capable of feeling. Knowing what my body is capable of, mentally and emotionally specifically, can make the seemingly easy tasks to outside eyes much more daunting. Which is why sometimes I do have to pull out all the tools that I have in those moments in my box. And one of those things that helps me the most in the hardest times is cannabis. I think this is why they say healing is linear, or not linear. They say that healing is not linear, it's cyclical. Because in order to heal, you have to face the pain. And in order to face the pain, you have to feel the feelings. But in order to feel the feelings, you have to understand why you have them and where they come from, which then requires you to start learning how to regulate your nervous system so you can teach yourself to notice when that damaging thought cycle begins, and in turn, learn how to regulate your system through the process of healing those neural pathways and narratives. And this cycle is just inherently exhausting. But we also don't live in a society that takes invisible struggles into consideration when setting expectations, especially when it comes to day-to-day existence. We have to keep on trudging ahead in order to live. I do think there is very little empathy or understanding in what we call our, quote, normal experience, which is systematically flawed itself. And if you are someone who has the kind of neurodivergence that makes it just that much harder to operate in the, quote, normal, keeping up is a constant uphill battle. I had been keeping a really strong mask going for a long time, a belief system and an identity that I was comfortable in. But there's nothing quite like a mental health crisis that will tear every aspect of that projected identity down and highlight all the parts of yourself that you have ignored, which often are the hardest to face. These days, I can barely mask. It's exhausting and it feels really uncomfortable, but I do have to save my capacity to do it for the moments that require it, such as doing really uncomfortable things at work. And within that, there are its own struggles. It feels incredibly uncomfortable and inauthentic to have to put it back on, which can be a huge contributing factor to why having to fit into a, quote, normal life can sometimes be the most challenging task of all, especially when you really, really start to like who you are deep down behind those identities that have kept your nervous system safe for so long. Getting to know yourself on an authentic level and a very personal level is one of the most grief-ridden, exhilarating, bittersweet, and deeply rewarding experiences I think we can face. For that is where I think our joy really lies, in getting to live the life that we want as the person we deeply, deeply down there know that we are. So I can sit here right now in this room, speaking into this microphone, and recognize that I have come a long fucking way from where I was last year. I am still knee deep in the healing process. Right now, it feels like I am trudging through mud, but my stamina is improving. And one of the biggest contributors to that is cannabis. It is a beautiful tool to have in my box. It helps me regulate and sometimes forces my body and nervous system to rest. And I'll tell you, a good smoke and an edible can sure allow a lot of breathing room for me to sit and do the work that is needed for my mental health. For instance, one of the things that comes along with unmasking is the acknowledgement of chronic pain, in a very head-on way. My body, often my ankles and my feet in particular, ache all the time. And it's something that has just been a part of my life, and I have just been able to really ignore because I was numbing myself out to feeling certain things by wearing a very specific mask. But I can also tell you, a good indica is a perfect balm for that pain, perhaps the purple punch variety, and CBD, thank the good goddess for CBD, can work miracles. I think there can be quite a misconception around what it is to work on healing your mental health, especially when the physical chemistry of your brain is the thing that's driving the negative experiences. There's never an end to healing. My neurodivergency doesn't go away. It's just how my brain's programmed. My mix of depression and newly discovered ADHD, which is definitely a huge contributor to my depression, is a reflection of the blueprint of my mind. It's just how I'm wired, which makes certain things much harder to do in general, but tenfold when my mental health is struggling. And when you have to exist in a world where you are not the neurotypical, if there even is such a thing, it is inherently just going to be harder. But that's where cannabis comes in. If I'm already prone to certain struggles because of my mental health makeup, I can use cannabis as the preventative medicine to help find a sustainability in my life, which can oftentimes feel unattainable when your mind feels chaotic. Okay. All right. I know this has been a pretty upfront insight into the inner workings of my world, but what's life without a little bit of vulnerability? Drab, I tell you, it's drab. And through all this self-discovery, this therapy, personal work, meditation, resting, the lot, I started to become a little student of my experiences. Last spring, I had the opportunity to become a certified medical cannabis consultant, as I have talked about, and that door opened a very new world of understanding and, in turn, curiosity. Learning the way that this plant has been used medicinally for thousands and thousands of years and learning how it actually interacts with our genetic makeup was the thing that my ever curious brain needed to deep dive into, a curiosity that could fuel the fire of passion in my belly and really just help me heal. The more I learn, the more I can be intentional about noticing how the cannabinoids affect me, how different terpenes interact with the chemistry of my body, how it can create specific experiences. And I can notice how the uplifting effects of limonene can be a great pick-me-up on a mentally grinding day. I can feel how pining helps me focus in on one task for more than short spurts, keeping my ADHD at bay and allowing important things to get done. How CBD helps relieve the stress that my muscles have been carrying all day when it's been a really long and grueling day. How CBC adds a touch of euphoric bliss to the recipe, keeping my energy uplifted. All from the CB1 receptors in my brain, intercepting the different cannabinoids and terpenes in my body to help manage the mental and physical stress my neurodivergency has the ability to cause. And in turn, it helps me manage moving through the day-to-day as I learn to work with my brain, not against it. Cannabis allows my body to take the breaks it needs when life gets overwhelming, and recovering from a mental health crisis is indeed overwhelming. And I don't think it's a huge leap to consider that maybe the natural cannabinoid receptors that we have running along our nervous system are ready to receive the cannabinoids and terpenes that we can introduce into our body using cannabis, which is abundant in both of those things. And in turn, our endocannabinoid system allows our nervous system to allocate these cannabinoids and terpenes to the parts of our body that need extra help with stress management and healing, which would absolutely include our brain, which would mean that the therapeutic properties in cannabis can also help with our mental health and, in turn, our mental illness. So on a large scale, large scientific scale, this might just be the beginnings of a theory. But I do think that I have some sturdy ground to walk on here. I'm a scientist at heart, and I do plan on testing this theory as often as I can. So 420, baby, blaze it. You know what I mean? But also science. So these days, we are starting to see studies surface around cannabis and mental health, but it is still a very new discussion, especially when both things come with different kinds of stigmas that really need changing. And the only way to do that is through education and sharing our experiences. This sect of the world holds its own interesting challenges. Not only does it require people to open their minds on the surface at a personal and sociological level, it also requires folks to be willing to believe the experiences that people with extra neurospicy brains live. And just because you haven't experienced something doesn't negate it. It just means it might be time to deconstruct what is considered real and not real within your belief system. Because I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, my depression and my ADHD are very, very real for me. It's really exciting to be witnessing the growth of new knowledge, both within the cannabis and mental health world. And they both have really relit the fiery warmth of passion that sits in my soul. And honestly, it was a fire that I didn't realize was going out. But, I guess having to sustain in a culture that has the ability to drive us into the ground by co-opting our strengths will indeed do that to a kid. And even though it has been the most challenging year of my life to date, it feels really, really fucking incredible to be sitting here sharing my story with anybody who might be interested in listening. The amount of self-discovery that can happen once you decide to prioritize your own well-being can truly be life-changing, which is what has happened to me. So if you feel so inclined and you are legally allowed, or at least can safely do so, maybe grab a joint or a gummy, go sit your little booty outside and give cannabis a try. You might realize you've been missing out on some of the biggest joys that life can bring you without even knowing it. And despite how hard it has been, I would do it again and again and again and again. So these days, I'm really trying to prioritize finding my work-life balance. Starting a new job during an extremely turbulent time has been so daunting, but there is also deep relief in starting over. I now get to consciously decide where to allocate my energy, where I need to set boundaries, and how I want to use the time that I get every day to learn about life. And if you're still here, thank you so much for listening to my story. I started this podcast to start sharing all the things that I've learned about medical cannabis in hopes of helping others and helping them find an avenue of maybe preventative care that could change their life like it changed mine. And if I also have learned anything from being a union organizer, it's that sharing personal experiences and stories is truly the best way to connect with others. Maybe someone feels seen today after listening to my word purge, and if so, please know you are not alone, and there are ways to start healing the parts of you that feel broken. For me, I started with cannabis. Maybe it could for you too.